It's a great pleasure to come here to talk to you about oxygen monitoring, even though talking to you about oxygen may seem like bringing coals to Newcastle. I hope to give you a little different point of view, that of a ex-aeronautical engineer, which is my former life, and I'm still a pilot, and I love all things connected with airplanes. And you'll see me sneak those analogies in frequently. But also as a current anesthesiologist who still practices in the operating room. So yeah, I had to start with a little Tucson theme there. I am from the University of Arizona, and in fact here is my university campus. That's our medical center, front and center, with the Catalina Mountains in the background. Those go up to 9,500 feet. I have a little cabin up there to escape the warm summers, which are just starting about this time of year. And in fact, if you look very closely there, you can just see my house. There it is right there. Takes me about 12 minutes to drive to work in the morning, and as somebody who has spent the rest of my life in Southern California, you can imagine how much I appreciate only spending 12 minutes on the road every morning. Hypoxia. The most common cause of malpractice settlements against anesthesiologists, if you look at the court documents, it'll say failure to adequately ventilate the patient. Now, we know that lawyers don't understand physiology, and what they really mean by that is failure to adequately oxygenate the patient. It is hypoxia at the tissue level that leads to bad outcomes in patients almost every time. Whether that hypoxia is caused by inadequate delivery of oxygen or inadequate oxygenation of the blood in the lungs. And we'll talk about those different options. Furthermore, when a cardiac arrest is caused by hypoxia, that is, the heart has been deprived of oxygen for so long that it actually stops beating, those cardiac arrests have a very, very poor prognosis, because even if the heart is restored and the other organs are, you can guess which organ tends to be irreversibly damaged by the time you have stoppage of the heart, and of course that's the brain. Here's the outline of what we're going to cover today. We'll start with a brief, and I emphasize brief for anybody who doesn't care too much for physiology, review of oxygen transport. Actually, I think you'll enjoy this. There's only one equation. One, count them, one. And then we'll talk about the monitoring at the 4 stages of what I call the 4 stages of oxygen transport, only one of which is in the arterial blood, and that's part of what I want to emphasize. It starts with the respired gas, which when I was a resident, that's all we had. We monitored oxygen, FiO2, and the respired gas, and that was it. There was nothing else. Now, of course, we have pulse oximetry that gets us to the arterial blood. We will also talk a little about monitoring at the tissue level, where the oxygen has to go, and what's left in the venous blood. There's not a lot new in respired gas monitoring, and so in the interest of time, we're going to skip that. And now here is our brief review of oxygen transport. I emphasize brief. This will take 5 minutes. Take a deep breath. And as I said, 5 minutes and only one equation. So when we're at rest, sitting here right now, eating a nice meal among friends, we are consuming this huge number of oxygen molecules every second. That's a 1 with 20 zeros behind it. In other words, it's 10 to the 20th. We cannot deliver that many oxygen molecules from the atmosphere to the mitochondria in our cells, which is where it has to go, by simple molecular diffusion. We're too big for that, and it's too many oxygen molecules. So to get that job done, we have evolved or been blessed with this beautifully designed, incredibly functioning cardiopulmonary system, whose main purpose in life is to deliver oxygen, to take oxygen from the atmosphere into the lungs, connect the oxygen to this compound called hemoglobin, which is a wonderful thing in itself, in the arterial blood, deliver that oxygen from the left side of the heart to the tissues, and at normal resting conditions, we're delivering about 1 liter of oxygen a minute. That's at a resting cardiac output of about 5 or 6 liters a minute. So some simple numbers to remember. One is you deliver about 1 liter of oxygen per minute to the tissues. Now, of that liter, you're not using most of it. You're only using about 250 cc's a minute, sitting here right now, basically at rest. The other 3/4 of that oxygen remains behind in the venous blood, and it goes back to the right heart for another circuit to the lungs and around the system again. Well, that system, as you can imagine, is fairly complex. As I said, it's beautifully regulated and has a lot of reserves, but there are a number of things that can go wrong with it, and that's why we need oxygen monitoring. As I said, I divide oxygen monitors into 4 stages of the transport process, starting with the respired gas, which when I was a resident was all we had. We had an FiO2 meter. That was a Clark electrode placed in the respired gas circuit. Later on, we came up with mass spectrometers, which were nice because they could measure other gases besides just oxygen. And they also worked very fast, so they could tell the difference between inspired and expired oxygen concentrations, as well as measuring CO2 and other gases. Then we went to Raman spectrometers, which can even measure nitrogen, expired nitrogen. And in our anesthesia machines today, we still have either fuel cells or paramagnetic analyzers to tell us that there is oxygen in our circuit. Then we took the next great step, which we'll spend the bulk of this lecture on, and that is monitoring oxygen at the stage of the arterial blood through either pulse oximetry, or I am going to talk briefly about some invasive alternatives, particularly the intra-arterial Optode, because I want to contrast that with pulse oximetry. As wonderful as pulse oximetry is, it has physiologic limitations that we need to talk about, both as engineers and as clinicians, and people need to be aware of this at all times when they're using pulse oximeters. But remember that that's only the second step of this 4-stage process. The oxygen has to get to the tissues. There are monitors that work at that level. I will point out to you that the oldest of all oxygen monitors, namely looking at the color of your patient, looking at the color of the skin, is an oxygen monitor at the tissue level. We also have near-infrared spectroscopy. I'll say a couple of words about that. I can't resist talking about transcutaneous oxygen measurement, which is, again, a non-invasive monitor. And we'll talk very, very briefly about some invasive alternatives for measuring organ-specific oxygen levels in the tissues. Last but not least, we have what's left in the venous blood. And at the very end of the talk, I'll show you why that is useful. It is only invasive. It is only available invasively today. In fact, it requires a pulmonary artery catheter, a Swan-Ganz catheter. Maybe sometime soon we could think of a way to measure this non-invasively and thereby assess how the body is using its oxygen reserves. All right, so pulse oximetry, as I said, is only working at step 2 of that 4-stage process. Now here is the brief review of physiology, starting with hemoglobin. This is the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, or equivalently, it could be the oxygen content of the blood, as a function of the oxygen partial pressure, or what we call PO2 of the blood. Notice 2 things about this oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. One is, as you get above PO2s of about 70, there's nothing happening. In other words, the hemoglobin is essentially fully saturated above PO2s of 70 or 80, and it can't carry any more oxygen. The second thing you notice, the reason I showed this particular version of the curve, is that it's not just one curve. It is a myriad of curves, a family of curves, and this is by design. These curves are shifted to the right, as shown here, which facilitates the unloading of oxygen from the hemoglobin into the tissues. So it makes it easier to deliver the oxygen to the tissues. And the things that shift it to the right are stresses, decreased pH, acidemia, increased temperature, fever. 2,3-diphosphoglycerate is a regulator that the body uses to actively control the location of that hemoglobin curve. And finally, hypercarbia, elevated PCO2. All of those influences tend to move that curve further to the right to help you unload. Okay, so that's hemoglobin. How much oxygen can that hemoglobin carry in your, for example, arterial blood? Well, here's the answer. First formula. So this is not referring to carbon dioxide. This is the content of oxygen in the blood, arterial, venous, or whatever, equals the sum of two terms. And the first one here is the oxygen bound to the hemoglobin. So it's 1.38, which is a dissociation constant, multiplied by the hemoglobin in grams per deciliter, multiplied by the saturation of that hemoglobin in whatever blood we are considering, arterial, venous, etc. Notice that if your hemoglobin is 15 and your saturation is 100%, which would make this number 1.0, this number by itself comes out to about 21. So that's another number to remember, roughly 21. And the units are vols percent, which is milliliters of oxygen per deciliter of blood. Very odd units that we doctors use. Sorry about that. Now there's another term here which I'm only going to talk about once, and then we're going to neglect it. And that second term is the oxygen dissolved in solution in the plasma. It's 0.003, which is the solubility coefficient, times the oxygen tension, or the PO2. Now the highest PO2 you can get in your arterial blood at sea level is less than 100, unless you're breathing supplemental oxygen. So let's say this is 100, then this number is going to be 0.3. And as I said, this number here, oxygen bound to hemoglobin, is about 21. So you can see that the oxygen dissolved in the plasma is for most purposes negligible, and we will in fact neglect it for the rest of this argument. Okay? So we've got that formula for oxygen content, and the normal arterial value, as I said, is about 21 milliliters of oxygen per deciliter of blood. Okay, how much oxygen are we consuming? That's the second and last step in this derivation that's going to get us to the one count and one equation for today, and then we can relax and go on to monitoring. The oxygen that's consumed, which we call VO2, is equal to the oxygen that's delivered from the arterial blood to the tissues minus the part of that oxygen that you do not use. In other words, minus the part that comes back to the right heart in the venous blood. Okay, well, we can put in expressions for both of those. We know that the oxygen delivery is equal to the oxygen content of that arterial blood multiplied by the flow of that arterial blood, which of course is the cardiac output. Now we're going to assume that our patient, which is you and I, doesn't have any plumbing problems, so that the blood flow on both the right and the left side of the circulation is the same number, and it's equal to the cardiac output. So that means our venous return term is in the same form, but it's going to be the venous oxygen content of the blood multiplied by the flow of the venous blood, again, the cardiac output. Well, I have numbers from the previous slide to put in here for Ca and CVO2. First, I'll factor out cardiac output because that appears in both terms. Nice getting simpler equation, but now I want to put this in terms of things that I can actually measure either in the clinical laboratory or in the operating room, and I can't measure CaO2. So I'm going to plug in for that from the previous slide, 1.38 times the hemoglobin times the arterial saturation of hemoglobin. So notice now I'm putting in a specific blood saturation, the arterial blood saturation. For the venous content, same form, 1.38 times the hemoglobin multiplied by the venous blood saturation. Notice again I have common terms here, 1.38 in hemoglobin, so I can factor those out. And what I'm left with is something that should be giving you all chills. It does me, and there should be a drum roll, because this is, of course, the Fick equation. Factoring out the common terms, 13.8, oops, wait a minute. Barker made a mistake. It's supposed to be 1.38, not 13.8. Well, it's not my mistake. It's these doctors who insist on using crazy units because we measure hemoglobin, as I said, in grams per deciliter, deciliter being 1/10 of a liter, but we measure cardiac output in liters per minute. And since there's 10 deciliters in a liter, a factor of 10 crept in there, so it is in fact 13.8 times the hemoglobin times the cardiac output times the difference between the arterial and the venous saturation. Now let's look at some examples starting with normal resting values. Whenever I come up with a new equation or a formula, the first thing I do is put in numbers where I know the answer to make sure the formula gives me the right answer. So here are the normal numbers. Here's your Fick equation again on top. Hemoglobin should be 15. Your resting cardiac output's about 5 liters. Your arterial saturation should be 98%, and your venous about 75%, as I said before. You do the math with your wristwatch calculator, and you'll get an answer of 238 mLs per minute, which is close enough to 250. Like I said, you're consuming about 250 mLs at rest. But a more important question is, what can you do? You all look like you're in pretty decent shape. I'll tell you that even in my advanced state of decrepitude, I can go out and play singles tennis for an hour, and I frequently do. And when I do that, here is roughly what I am doing. I am raising my cardiac output from 5 liters a minute to about 20, so I'm quadrupling my resting cardiac output. But that's not all I'm doing. You can't get to good exercise values just by raising cardiac output. You have to desaturate the venous blood. You use some of that venous oxygen reserve. There is no reason to leave your venous blood at 75% saturation. You can drop it all the way down to at least 40%. So you do both of those things when you play singles tennis, and if you crank those numbers, you'll see that the answer is about 2,400 milliliters a minute. In other words, I have multiplied my resting metabolic rate times 10. And that should sound familiar because that's what the cardiologists all want you to do when they put you on that treadmill. What is their goal on the treadmill? Get you to 10 METs, and that's what it means. It means to get you to 10 times your basal metabolic rate. And that's what you're doing when you play singles tennis, and this is how you're doing it with both of those mechanisms. Now, the French Open is going on right now. What can those tennis players do? They can put us, at least me, to shame. I mean, maybe I can do 20 liters cardiac output. Bjorn Borg, if you remember him, was put on a ballistic cardiogram, and a couple of the Mark Spitz was also put on one. You remember him, the 7 gold medals. He always looked kind of ridiculous wearing all those medals. They measured their cardiac output, and it was 50 liters a minute. Now, put this in context. You've got about 5 liters of blood, roughly 10 units, in your whole body. You're pumping your entire blood volume out of the top of your aorta like a fire hose in 6 seconds. Try to imagine that. 6 seconds, your whole blood volume. So at that cardiac output, and even leaving the venous saturation at 40, these guys are doing over 6 liters a minute oxygen consumption, or 25 METs. Wow. So that's what the human body can do. Now, our patients use these same terms to compensate for disease, these same 2 mechanisms. And here's how they do it. Here's the Fick equation again, same as before. We're going to have a patient who's severely anemic, which means their hemoglobin is low. And we're going to give this patient, this hypothetical patient, a hemoglobin of 2.5. And you say, that's a hematocrit of 7.5. No way, that person's dead. There's no way they can be alive. Well, not so fast. If they can raise their cardiac output to just 15, not 20 like I said that you and I can do, but just 15, drop their venous sat to 40, do the math, they're consuming 300 mLs a minute. In other words, normal oxygen consumption with a hemoglobin of 2.5. And I wouldn't have believed this except that I have seen it. with my own eyes in trauma patients and in Jehovah's Witness patients who did not accept transfusions and had these kind of levels of anemia and actually survived. So now we're done with the physiology. That wasn't so bad, I hope. Here's a picture of my backyard in Tucson, the great storm of '07, I call this. Yes, it actually snows in Tucson. For me, that's a novelty. I know for some people it's kind of commonplace, but now let's talk about the 4 stages. As I said, the respiratory gas, it was interesting when we went from the Clark electrode to the mass spec and the Raman, and I think there may be a renaissance of respired gas monitoring if we can make it more accurate and faster. But there's nothing very recent to talk about, so I'm going to skip on to the next stage in the interest of time. And that is, of course, the arterial blood, where we're going to spend most of our time, actually. Before we talk about pulse oximetry, though, let's talk about intra-arterial PO2, or oxygen tension. How do you do that? Well, first of all, when I say intra-arterial, that means, of course, invasive, something in the artery. Here's a technology that I want to tell you a little about called the Optode. This term was coined by Derek Lubers, who I've met. He was one of the original inventors. What it is a fluorescent dye at the tip of a long, thin optical fiber. And the interesting thing about this probe is that it measures PO2, not hemoglobin oxygen saturation, but oxygen partial pressure. How does it do that? It has the dye encapsulated behind a membrane at the tip of an optical fiber. Now, fluorescent or photoluminescent dyes have this interesting property that when you irradiate them with incident light of a particular color, which means of a particular wavelength, they radiate back fluorescent light, and you think, well, so what? Well, but the key is it's a different color. The fluorescent light radiated back up this fiber is a different color from the incident light, a different wavelength, and so you can measure it at the same time that you are exciting the dye. And you're still thinking, well, so what? What good is that? Well, there is a property of some of these dyes called photoluminescence quenching, which means that in the presence of certain specific molecules in the environment of the dye, this photoluminescence or fluorescence process is interfered with, is blocked, and the amount of light coming back is less. There is one of these dyes called pyrene butyric acid where the specific molecule that blocks the fluorescence is oxygen, and only oxygen. Now, isn't that interesting? So now we have a probe that we can put in a medium, arterial blood or anywhere else, that can measure the amount of oxygen in that blood, the PO2, specifically the PO2. So these devices did hit the market in the late 80s, early 90s. I was involved in the development with a company called CDI, Cardiovascular Devices. It was later absorbed by 3M. They manufactured a 0.5 millimeter diameter optical fiber. It easily passed through, this pencil is for perspective, through the typical 20 gauge catheter that we use for arterial cannulas, radial artery cannulas in the patient's wrist. You can see it easily fits through that. It sticks out the end about 1 millimeter or 2 so that it's being bathed in real time in arterial blood. But not only does it measure PO2, they have other dyes that are sensitive to hydrogen ions. So you have the PO2 being displayed here from the pyrene butyric acid that I told you about, but you have another dye, I don't remember what it's called, that measures hydrogen ion, and so you display the pH. And if you can measure hydrogen ion, as John Severinghaus showed us, you can also measure carbon dioxide tension. And so, gee, this looks a lot like a blood gas machine, doesn't it? It's giving me pH, PCO2, and PO2, but it's in real time, like pulse oximetry, it's in real time telling me now what's happening now, and it's continuous. You can watch this thing change second by second. And you think, wow, I must have one of those in every operating room, right? Here is an actual case that I did back at Irvine, and this supports the idea that we would want to have these in every operating room. The continuous line is the PO2, it says O2 over here on the left, from the Optode. The little pluses here are data points from arterial blood gases sampled from the cannula and sent to the laboratory in the usual way. And you can see two things from this. One, the Optode and the blood gases were very close together, so the Optode was functioning quite well in measuring the PO2. But two, something happened in this case. Here's the Optode, excuse me, in room air, reading room air PO2, which is about 147. It's put into the patient's artery, and it's measuring his arterial PO2. He's on 100% oxygen, so that goes up to 500. The patient is intubated, and at that time his FiO2 is reduced from 100% to probably 50 or 40%, and the PaO2 should have come down from here at about 520 down to about here. And you can see it tried to level off there, in fact, but then something happened and it continued to go down. What is EBI? EBI stands for endobronchial intubation. We discovered in retrospect, this was a neurosurgical case. He had been repositioned, and this is about the time when he was repositioned. The endotracheal tube was inadvertently, that means accidentally and with maybe negligence, moved from the trachea into the main stem bronchus, and so the PO2 did not level off and it continued to drop. Now, where does the pulse oximeter tell me that something's going wrong? You have this long slide down this long hill, but remember, go back to the hemoglobin curve. Nothing happens at PO2s above 70 or 80. There you are on that graph, so the pulse ox alarm is going to go off somewhere where the arrow is shown there, and this whole long downhill slide, which was detected by the Optode, but nobody was looking at it, is going to be missed by pulse oximetry. And that is one of those physiologic limitations. We'll talk about that one more time. The Optode shows trends. This is not dangerous up here. This is not even dangerous down here where it's dropping below 200. But it's telling you, hey, something's wrong. Something's happening here that is not what we expected. You better look at the patient and see what's going on. The Optode gives you an early warning. The pulse oximeter does not, of these kind of changes. Puritan-Bennett, some of you may remember this company when it was an independent company. They made wonderful, excellent ventilators, probably the best ventilators on the market. They saw this opportunity. They came out with the Puritan-Bennett 3300 blood gas, Optode blood gas monitor. Here is their actual display, pH, PCO2, PO2. They put all their eggs in this basket and put it on the market. There were two problems market-wise. This was the early 90s. Managed care was just getting started. Cost cutting, cost consciousness. There were two problems with intra-arterial optodes, and I was very aware of and very frustrated by these problems. They didn't always work as beautifully as that case I just showed you. When you put something, a foreign body in the blood doesn't like that. It wants to coat it with fibrin and platelets and basically schmutz and cover it up and protect the body from it. So they were unreliable, and in fact a lot of patients, the Optodes simply didn't give reliable readings at all. They were also expensive. They could not get the cost of the disposable part down below about $300. That in the early 90s was a lot. As a result, you see what happened down here. Puritan-Bennett is no more. It was absorbed by Nellcor, which was eventually absorbed by Tyco, and the cycle goes on. It reminded me of the 6 phases of a project, and this was all driven by these two issues of reliability and high cost. And as you go through these 6 phases, as we got to search for the guilty, that's about when I bailed out. You could say I was one of the guilty. I was definitely on board here. I was very enthusiastic. I mean, I thought we're going to have these in every operating room. And I was, you know, like I said, I was associated with this CDI company. I thought they were going to be a huge success. By the time we got into punishment of the innocent and praise for the non-participants, I was long gone. But remember, optodes measure PO2, and that is something that we do want to know about. They will be back. In fact, they are back. There's still at least one company making optodes, but not for intra-arterial use, for tissue use. And they do have other applications. But we're going to go on now to pulse oximetry. Just remember to contrast that with the optode and what it can do. Back to the hemoglobin dissociation curve. To review, remember, the hemoglobin saturation is on the vertical axis here, the ordinate, and it reaches its flat part at PO2s above about 70 to 80. The pulse oximeter is measuring what's on the vertical axis there, the saturation, whereas the optode is measuring the horizontal axis, or the abscissa, which is the PO2. No SpO2 change above about here. And we in anesthesiology, of course, are normally working out here. In fact, clear to the right of the edge of the screen is where we like to live, because we're keeping our patients at FiO2s, normally 40% or greater. What is a pulse oximeter? Well, let's start with what is an oximeter. An oximeter is something that measures the oxygen in blood or in other solutions by basically looking at the color of the solution. And it makes use of the fact that oxyhemoglobin and reduced hemoglobin have very different light absorbing characteristics, as you see here by these absorbance spectra. The red curve here is the absorbance spectrum of oxyhemoglobin. This is wavelength or color of light on the horizontal axis in nanometers. This would be the visible red down here between 600 and 700. This is infrared out here above 800 or so. You can't see it, but we can measure it. Notice that oxyhemoglobin has a low absorbance in the visible red. That's why oxygenated blood looks red. It's allowing that red light to come through and get to your eyes. Whereas reduced hemoglobin has a relatively high absorbance in the visible red. That's why deoxygenated blood looks dark, in fact looks bluish. Notice that the relationship is reversed as you go out to the infrared. Now, I promised you only one equation, and I've already used that up. So I'm going to do this with arm waving instead of with Lambert-Beer law or any other equations. Isn't it obvious, be careful whenever a mathematician says that, isn't it obvious that if I have these two known light absorbance spectra and I measure the absorbance of a solution containing these two solutes, oxy and reduced hemoglobin, I measure at two wavelengths or two colors, such as the two shown here, 660 and 940 nanometers, that I ought to be able to measure, to determine at least the relative ratio of these two solutes in the solution by making two measurements. I've got two equations, I've got two unknowns, I can solve it. Here's this in words. If I measure the light absorbance at two wavelengths, I can measure the concentrations of two light absorbers. That is a key to pulse oximetry. It's good news and bad news. What I've just stated is the first of the three cardinal assumptions of conventional pulse oximetry. Assumption number one. So we'll get to all three assumptions, and I tell every clinician, remember the three assumptions whenever you use a pulse oximeter. Assumption number one, conventional pulse oximeters, conventional is underlined here for a reason because we're going to talk about more advanced pulse oximeters in a few moments. Conventional pulse oximeters have only two wavelengths of light, therefore they can only measure two absorbers in the blood, therefore there can only be two light absorbers in the blood for a conventional pulse oximeter to work, and those two absorbers are assumed to be reduced hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin. There's nothing else there. A little history of in vivo oximetry leading to the present. These are not particularly new devices, believe it or not. The first functioning in vivo oximeter was made in about 1938 by Carl Matthews. It was 2 wavelengths. It only measured trends, not absolute values, and it wasn't really arterial, but it worked. Millikan, I'll show you a picture of him. 1942, he developed an ear oximeter, which was actually lightweight, and he used it on pilots flying at high altitude and doing high G maneuvers to find out why they were blacking out. And it was very interesting. Hewlett-Packard, I remember this, developed an 8-wavelength ear oximeter. It never made it to the operating room, but it was used in pulmonary function laboratories. It was large, cumbersome. It looked like half a football helmet, basically. You put it on your head, and your head went like this because it weighed a ton. But it worked. Then along came Takuo Aoyagi, who has been my pleasure to meet him a couple of times. In 1974, he invented the pulse oximeter, and I'm going to show you why the word pulse is in there as opposed to these previous oximeters, which were not pulse oximeters. His first pulse oximeter, by the way, had fiber optic cables, and the light sources and the light detectors were in the box, not in the sensor as you have them now. He was working for Nihon Kohden. Scott Wilbur came along in 1980 working for Biox, and he was the one who first used light-emitting diodes as the light source so that the sources could be integrated directly into the ear or finger sensor, and he used photodiodes as the detector. So that was a major advance, and it made the sensors more lightweight and eliminated the fiber optic cables. Then along came a company called Masimo in 1995. They introduced their SET technology, or signal extraction technology, which gave us the first motion-resistant pulse oximetry. We'll talk a little about that. And along came the same company, Masimo, in 2005 with the first commercially produced multi-wavelength pulse oximeter, more than 2 wavelengths. You've already seen assumption number 1, and you can imagine I'm going to show you various common states where assumption number 1, only 2 absorbers in the blood, is violated. And Masimo multi-wavelength, which they call rainbow, allowed for the measurement of such things as carboxyhemoglobin and methemoglobin, and now total hemoglobin, which we'll talk about. Here is Millikan's original ear oximeter, and I have to say a word about this because this was Glenn Millikan, who was the son of Robert Millikan. Now, you already know that I'm a Caltech alumnus. That's where my PhD was from. Robert Millikan is the guy who did the famous oil drop experiment that measured the charge on an electron for the first time. And I know you use that number every day in your work, 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19th coulombs, which he discovered doing the oil drop experiment way back in the 20s. And so the Caltech Science Library, big, tall, 10-story library, is called Millikan Library because Millikan was at Caltech. The library is referred to as Millikan's last erection. This was Glenn Millikan, which shows that brains are to some degree hereditary, who invented this pulse oximeter for aviation research. How does the conventional pulse oximeter work? Now, I realize I'm showing you an old pulse oximeter because I'm going to talk for a few moments more about conventional pulse oximetry, and then we're going to get into what's next. This is actually the first pulse oximeter that had a major impact in the operating room, and it was the venerable Nellcor N100 in about 1982. Again, here is the inventor, Takuo Aoyagi. As I said, he was working for Nihon Kohden. He was actually trying to develop a non-invasive or semi-non-invasive cardiac output monitor, which would work by measuring dye dilution curves of green dye injected in a vein in a hand, and then he had the sensor on the ear that would measure the dye dilution curves. And just like doing thermodilution curves with a Swan-Ganz catheter, if you measure these exponential dye dilution curves, you can calculate the cardiac output. And he later actually did that. And I had the pleasure of reviewing his paper, which was one of those small world things. But while he was developing that, he discovered in 1974 that if you put a light source on one side of a vascular tissue, finger or ear, you put a photodetector on the other side of that tissue and you send light from one to the other, you have all these various absorbances, and of course he was interested in the light absorbance of blood, but he noticed that something was pulsating. And that was very annoying because he wanted smooth, exponentially decaying green dye dilution curves to calculate cardiac output. And he had these annoying pulsations which happened to be synchronous with the heartbeat. And he said, aha, or eureka, however you say that in Japanese, he realized very quickly that what was pulsating was the arterial blood, the volume of the arterial blood. And that is what makes a pulse oximeter a pulse oximeter. It looks at the pulsatile component of the absorbance. And you've already seen here that I have told you assumption number 2. So remember, assumption number 1, 2 and only 2 light absorbers. Assumption number 2, everything that fluctuates or pulsates in that light absorbance signal is caused by arterial blood. Now we know that's not always true, but that's Aoyagi's assumption. Okay, the final step, how do you get from there to saturation? Well, consider 2 extremes. This was again Aoyagi's reasoning. We have a patient with 100% saturation, happy face. Remember here are the dye dilution curves, just to remind you, I know those are very small, but remember the oxyhemoglobin has a low absorbance in the visible red, and therefore you'll get low pulsations in the visible red when there's a lot of oxyhemoglobin present, right? The reduced hemoglobin has a high absorbance in the infrared. The oxyhemoglobin conversely has a high absorbance in the infrared, and so you get large pulsations in the infrared. Now go to the patient who's very unhappy. He's got 0% saturation, and we look at the reduced hemoglobin curve, and it makes sense. The infrared has the low absorbance, and the red has the high absorbance, and so you get the large pulsations in the red, low in the infrared. And so if you take this ratio called red over infrared, shown here as A over B, it ought to somehow correlate or relate to the ratio of oxyhemoglobin to total hemoglobin or reduced hemoglobin in the arterial blood. And we're going to assume that this is specific to arterial blood because that's Aoyagi's assumption. Everything that pulsates is arterial. Now again, I've done that without equations because that's exactly how Aoyagi did it. The final step, how do you relate that ratio to the oxyhemoglobin saturation, or what we call SpO2? 2 wavelengths in conventional oximeters, pulse oximeters, tend to be around 660 and 940 nanometers. They measure first the ratio of the AC component, which is the fluctuating component, to the DC component at the red, and do the same ratio at the infrared. So now you got 2 ratios, a red one and an infrared one. What do you do next? You have 2 ratios. Well, let's take the ratio. And that's why this is often called the ratio of ratios, or red over infrared. So it's AC over DC red divided by AC over DC infrared. That is the number that's going to be related to the oxygen saturation in the arterial blood. Where do we get that relationship? The pulse oximeter goes to a lookup table built into its software, and for every value of R, there is a tabulated SpO2 value, and that's what it displays. And here's an example of that calibration curve. And if you think we're approaching assumption 3 here, you are correct. We're just about there. Here are the ratios, ratio of ratios. You see they range from 0.4 to 3.4 in this graph. Here are the saturation values that would be displayed on the face of the pulse oximeter. And the last remaining question is, where does this curve come from? And the answer is, of course, human volunteer data. So that's assumption number 3. One, count 'em, one curve fits all humanity, and that curve is empirical, that it is collected in laboratories like my own, where I take my anesthesia residents and medical students and even clinical staff and put them in a chair and make them hypoxic while we measure pulse oximeter values and calibrate the pulse oximeter. One empirical calibration curve fits the entire human race. So now you've got all 3 assumptions. There's assumption 3 restated again. Let's review them. Number 1, there are 2 and only 2 light absorbances in the human blood, reduced in oxyhemoglobin, again, for conventional pulse oximetry. Assumption 2, everything that fluctuates, or the only thing that fluctuates or pulsates, is arterial blood. And assumption 2, one, count 'em, one, empirical human volunteer calibration curve fits the whole human race. Knowing those 3 assumptions and keeping them in mind, this is why I tell the clinicians, you can determine, you can predict when the pulse oximeter is likely to be giving you inaccurate values. One category of errors is low signal to noise ratio, that is no pulse oximeter. Light interference is one of the causes of that. In early pulse oximeters, that was a serious problem. It's less of a problem now, but it's always a good idea not to have bright room lights shining directly on the pulse oximeter probe. Cover it up, shield it. Motion artifact we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but you can imagine if I'm wiggling my finger, what's happening? The arterial blood is not the only thing that's pulsating now, right? Everything is pulsating. Aoyagi's assumption. Low perfusion states, shock, for example, and venous pulsations. I tell my residents, do this, not after a full meal. Put a XYZ pulse oximeter probe on your ear, measure your saturation standing up, go over to the corner and stand on your head, put your feet against the wall and stand upside down and see what the pulse oximeter says. Almost all conventional pulse oximeters will read a number 4 to 8 points lower when you're standing on your head, and the reason is the venous blood is pulsating, venous pulsations. The second category of errors are those that I call assumption 1 errors. Remember assumption 1, 2 and only 2 colors in the arterial blood. So intravenous dyes, one of the initial discoveries that was very interesting is if you inject methylene blue, even 10 cc's of methylene blue dye into a vein, pulse oximeters will read incredibly low numbers. In fact, I tell people, if you've got an orthopedic surgeon, I tell this to anesthesiologists, an orthopedic surgeon who's kind of being irritating, he's got the country music turned up a little bit too loud, and he's, kibitzing your anesthetic, asking you why is the blood pressure so low, why is the heart rate so high. Do this. Turn your pulse oximeter beep tone up as loud as it'll go. Inject 10 cc's of methylene blue into the patient's vein, and then very quickly open a copy of the Wall Street Journal on your lap so that you're reading the journal when the saturation tone goes beep, 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 beep. Because the pulse oximeter with just 10 cc's of methylene blue will read as low as 4%. That's way off the calibration curve. So yeah, color is important here. Well, that'll lead us to dyshemoglobins, and we'll talk about that next. Again, violations of assumption number 1. Nail polish. This is a real pain. I mean, standard finger pulse oximeters, the light path does pass through the fingernail. There's no law that says it has to pass through the fingernail. You can reorient the probe so that it doesn't. Thick fingernail polish does cause errors in pulse oximetry. What if instead of the 2 hemoglobins that I showed you before, oxyhemoglobin here again and reduced hemoglobin, you have 2 additional friends, or maybe they're not so friendly, carboxyhemoglobin, and look at this. The light absorbance of the carboxyhemoglobin down here in the visible red looks exactly like oxyhemoglobin. These patients look great, okay? And the other one being MetHb, which is a nasty stuff. Notice that MetHemoglobin has a high absorbance throughout the red, and it's also high in the infrared. And if you've ever seen a patient with high MetHemoglobin levels, they look quite disgusting. They look very sick. It's a color you haven't seen before. It's kind of a grayish color. And if you look at the blood in vitro with MetHemoglobin levels of greater than about 20%, the blood actually looks like Hershey's chocolate syrup. It turns brown because MetHemoglobin absorbs light at all wavelengths. What happens? Well, here is a landmark experiment. Look at the date on this. 1987, I took what was then the leading conventional two-wavelength oximeter, pulse oximeter. This is done in dogs. We exposed the dogs to carbon monoxide, and by the way, we were only using about 100 parts per million, which is a very low level. That level is fatal to anyone if you were exposed long enough. As the carboxyhemoglobin level gradually came up from 0 to, as you can see here, we got up to about 70 to 80% before the dogs expired. This is the actual laboratory measurement of fractional saturation measured by a multi-wavelength co-oximeter. So this is what's really happening here on the filled-in squares. And here's the pulse oximeter. Basically, fat, dumb, and happy. The pulse oximeter, conventional pulse oximeter, quote, sees carboxyhemoglobin as though it were mostly oxyhemoglobin. In other words, it's saying everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's okay. It's still reading 92%. I don't know why the dog died. Must have been something else. So that led me to start saying as early as 1987, hey, I love to say I told you so. It's one of the pleasures of becoming senior, you can say that. Why don't you pulse oximeter manufacturers come out with more wavelengths so that we can fix this problem? So I went back and did the same thing with MetHemoglobin. And with the dogs in MetHemoglobin, I tried a number of ways to get their MetHemoglobin levels up. And what I arrived at, what really worked best, was benzocaine, which is a very common topical local anesthetic. In fact, it's still marketed as a topical spray under the names Cetacaine and Hurricane. If you look at both of those canned topical locals, they are 17 to 20% benzocaine. Spray benzocaine into the trachea of the animals, and you got Met levels that did this. Again, the solid squares and this line are the true co-oximeter measured saturations. As the Met level comes up to 60, which is fatal in anybody, the true saturation comes down linearly. The pulse oximeter, notice it behaves differently. It doesn't stay in the 90s like it did for carboxy. It does come down, but it comes down at about half the slope that it should, and it flattens out. It flattens out at a saturation of about 85% as you get to really high MetHemoglobin levels. And I scratched my head and thought, why is that? Well, let's think. It's the ratio of ratios. With MetHemoglobin, remember, it's turning the blood brown. So I'm adding a large absorbance. I'm adding a number to both the red and the infrared. In other words, I'm adding a number to both the numerator and the denominator of a ratio. What happens to a ratio when you add large numbers to both the top and the bottom? It drives that ratio towards 1. Go back to that calibration curve I showed you and look up a ratio of ratios of 1, and guess what? It's a SAT of 85%. So I published this conclusion in 1989, and it was verified by a number of clinical case reports. So why don't pulse oximeters measure Met and carboxy? I've been asking this question since the late 80s, and the answer is finally, they can. And of course, you are all familiar with this device. The Rainbow RAD7 or RAD57 handheld version, announced in 2005. I got my hands on one of these as quickly as I could to have some fun. It uses what Masimo calls Rainbow technology, which is multi-wavelength. Initially 8 wavelengths, now they're using even more. It provides SPCO, which is a pulse oximeter estimate of the carboxyhemoglobin percentage, SP-MET, same thing for methemoglobin, and the usual SpO2 or oxygen saturation. We will get through the dyshemoglobins here, and then that's a good breaking point. It comes, as I said, in a handheld version, which can be used in the hospital and in the field, and these are very, very popular, in fact, almost universal in fire departments. I didn't realize until recently in talking to these guys that the people at greatest risk for carbon monoxide poisoning in building fires are not the people that were in the building. They have sense enough to get the hell out. It's the firefighters. They have to keep going back in, and they're the ones that get exposed. So, of course, I got a hold of one of these in '06 and did lab studies, and I wasn't going to do patient studies because you'd have to wait too long to get patients who happen to have carboxyhemoglobin levels that high, so I'm going to do it to my residents and medical students, of course. So I got 10 volunteers in each group. We later expanded that to a lot more people. Radial artery lines, arterial cannulas in all patients, peripheral IVs, and standard ASA monitors, which means in addition to pulse oximetry, EKG, blood pressure, and end-tidal CO2. We use blood co-oximetry, 125 wavelength co-oximeter as the, quote, gold standard. So we drew blood samples from the radial artery and put them in the co-oximeter to measure levels as our gold standard. And then the two groups, the volunteers divided into two groups. The lucky group was the COHb group. They breathed 500 parts per million carbon monoxide until their carboxyhemoglobin level got to just 15%, which is not at all toxic. I was not going to take any chances because I want all my residents to finish the program, right? So we took them up to 15%. Some of them got to 17 or 18%. To put it in context, by the way, smokers, I hope you don't smoke. If you do, I'm going to try to scare you out of it. Smokers routinely get up to 10, 12%, maybe even higher. The methemoglobin group, which was the unlucky group, they initially got sprayed in the mouth with benzocaine spray because I knew that would work. I wasn't going to spray it in their tracheas, that would be harmful. But I sprayed their mouths with benzocaine until one of them called me the next morning, a medical student, very nice kid, and he said, Dr. Barker, I'm not, and I noticed his speech was a little slurred, I'm not complaining at all, but can you tell me when I might be able to taste anything again? So I thought, that's the end of that study. He recovered, he did fine. But we discovered this drug, sodium nitrite, which I was unfamiliar with. It's an FDA-approved drug for the treatment of cyanide poisoning. Very effective. In fact, it treats cyanide by forming methemoglobin. We gave the FDA-recommended dose, which is 300 milligrams, and we got MET levels up to 12, and actually later we got a subject up to a MET level of 19, which was a little higher than I wanted to go, but she got some methylene blue, which is the treatment, and did fine. And look at this. This is amazing. This is SP-MET from the pulse oximeter compared to the methemoglobin from the gold standard co-oximeter. The tightness of that fit is incredible. Remember, this is a very low and fairly small range, only out to 14%. Look at that precision. Remember, the bias is the average error, virtually zero. The precision is the standard deviation of the error, in other words, the random scatter, 0.5%. That's 4 times better than the precision of a regular pulse oximeter for regular saturation. Why is it so good? Because it's multiple wavelength and there's a lot of signal from methemoglobin. Methemoglobin turns the blood to chocolate syrup. It's got a lot of signal. So that is an interesting, not totally unexpected side effect. And as I said, we got some subjects that were further up on the scale here. Very good accuracy. Now here for carboxyhemoglobin, it looks like, oh, you think, oh, that's not very good. Well, actually, it's just as good as conventional pulse oximetry is for conventional saturation. Because look at the precision. Again, precision, standard deviation of the error or the random error, 2%. That's exactly the same as the precision of a conventional pulse oximeter for conventional SpO2 saturation. So that's the accuracy of the two. To summarize multi-wavelength, conventional pulse oximeters cannot measure, not only can't measure any of these dyshemoglobins, they can't even measure SpO2 in the presence of either of these dyshemoglobins, as I showed in my experiments. The rainbow measures both carboxy and MET. It also measures SpO2. Now the SpO2 algorithm is still, in the refinement stage, I believe, but it tells you when you have carboxy and or MET. Based on our first experimental study, the uncertainty is about 2% for carboxy, in other words, the same as conventional pulse oximetry, and about 0.5% for MET. Is this important? Well, I'll give you two examples to convince you, and then we'll take our coffee break. For carboxy, this is getting old news already, but just remember the Sago mine disaster. 12 miners died of CO toxicity. There are about 40,000 CO poisoning cases make it to the ERs every year. Many of these involve children because they're usually improperly vented heaters inside of closed buildings. And even if they don't die, the problem with carboxy hemoglobin, if you get to really toxic levels like 50% or more, is how many IQ points did you lose? That's a serious problem. Back to Sago Mine for a minute. If you don't remember this, there was one of the miners, a young guy, who actually survived relatively intact. How did he survive? The other miners gave him their oxygen. The other 12 died. For methemoglobin, we cause the toxicity, almost always, with drugs. And here's a partial list of the drugs we give. I've already told you about Cetacane and Hurricane, which are no longer in my repertoire. I will not use these topicals because they're benzocaine. Dapsone, that is the drug that's used to treat Hansen's disease or leprosy. All of the anti-malarials, chloroquine, flutamide, lidocaine, in fact, all of the local anesthetics will cause it. Anything that has nitrate or nitrite, I already told you about sodium nitrite. Even nitric oxide, yes, just say NO. We got a lot of kids now with heart problems waiting for transplant, and for their pulmonary hypertension, they're getting INO, inhaled nitric oxide. It would be nice to monitor their methemoglobin levels. Yes, even nitroglycerin and nitroprusside, and yes, even my favorite anesthetic, nitrous oxide. So here's the last example, and then it's time for a break. Real case, honest to God, I am not making this up. March 2007, I'm sitting in my office. I have an early version of the RAD-57 handheld sitting on my desk, and I get a call. There's a 70-year-old woman having excision of a squamous cell carcinoma from her cheek. She's pretty sick. She's not a healthy 70. She's got a small mouth opening, so they decided she needed an awake intubation, which means we're going to put in the endotracheal tube through the mouth while the patient is awake. To do that, you need to do some topicalization of the mouth and the tongue. You need to put some local anesthetic in there somehow. You can also do some nerve blocks with injections. But they chose to topicalize her with my favorite, not topical anesthetic, Cetacane, which, as you know already, is benzocaine. They sprayed her vigorously, and on later cross-examination by me, they admitted that, yeah, maybe she inhaled once while they were spraying, maybe. 20 minutes later, she looked kind of dusky, kind of that unhealthy kind of gray color, and the saturation on the conventional pulse oximeter was reading 88%. Does that ring a bell? They called me, asked me if I had this monitor. I said, yeah. Well, they told me the story. I said, yeah, I'll be right down. Put it on her, and look just at this part. The first level I got with the RAD-57 was 13% MET. And I said, yeah, sure enough, you got her. You nailed her with the Cetacane. Put in an arterial line, and let's draw some blood gases, and let's monitor them. And, A, to make sure that she does well, and B, you can get a nice little paper out of this and maybe a case report. So they did. They called me back. I went back to my office. They called me back about 15 minutes later, and they said, Dr. Barker, are you still here? I said, yeah, what's the matter? Is the device not working anymore? And they said, well, I don't know if it's working or not, but it says 33%. I come running down to the OR. And you notice here, it says 33%, but we still don't have any data from the laboratory. And this is often the problem. We finally I started calling the laboratory, and what did they say? They said, we can't give you a MET reading because it's off scale. Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. We finally got a MET reading from the lab, and you see it's like 27%. That's very toxic. Now, we start giving, you know, by the time we get the lab reading, we know that she is in trouble. We call for methylene blue, which is the treatment. There was a delay in getting the methylene blue, so we didn't give it to her until about 3 o'clock, as you see here. When she got the methylene blue, she immediately started getting better. And you notice here that the Rad-57 pulse oximeter and the laboratory SP MET levels, or MetHb levels, tracked perfectly as she came back down to low values. She did fine. She went home the next day, she did fine. So this was a great example of this device not only diagnosing a serious methemoglobinemia, but also monitoring the treatment of it. Again, continuous and real time. That's what you want. Late diagnosis from the lab, the ability to monitor the treatment in real time. Methemoglobinemia is a real problem in hospitals. This is a study that was done before the Rad-57 was available. Retrospective multi-center study, 138 cases, and they looked at ICU patients for 2 years, and they found that 400 out of 2,000 ICU patients had high MET levels. A lot of those were unexpected. They were found incidentally by co-oximetry. These acquired high MET levels led to at least 1 death and 3 near deaths. And so the recommendation of their paper at the end was we ought to frequently check for methemoglobin in any patient in the ICU because we know they're going to be getting at least 1 drug that causes methemoglobin, guaranteed. You know, the chances are. What was the expense of that? That would be co-oximetry blood gas sampling on every ICU patient. That's what they recommended. So it sure would be nice to do that with a non-invasive device. What else can we measure with multi-wavelength pulse oximetry? What about, and of course you know where I'm going next, what about total hemoglobin? Nobody would say that this is not important. It was announced at the World Congress in March 2008 that Masimo was able to accomplish this breakthrough. These are the first published data from the STA meeting. I always like to promote the STA meeting when I can. Here is SP hemoglobin, in other words, hemoglobin, total hemoglobin measured by the pulse oximeter versus hemoglobin measured by the laboratory during elective liver transplantation. Here is a real single case. The SP hemoglobin is the continuous line here. You can see how it varies. This is typical during liver transplantation. Wide swings in hemoglobin. The dots here are the laboratory values. That is priceless. We took care of assumption number 1. Remember, there are 2 and only 2 light absorbers in the human blood. Now let's get into some errors related to assumption number 2, and that is the only thing that pulsates is arterial blood. And we'll talk about failure rate. When is a continuous monitor not continuous? Remember, one of the biggest advantages of pulse oximetry is it's continuous and real time. And the answer, of course, is when it fails to work. Is the pulse oximeter a, quote, fair weather friend? And I'll show you the evidence for that. Early failure studies, one famous one by this Overend fellow, 1990. Wow, that's 21 years ago. Ooh. Retrospective reviews of thousands of charts, they define failure as no SpO2 value for a half an hour, and they found the failure rate is only about 1%. Well, that's acceptable. I'll accept 99% success. But they found another interesting result that people ignored. Well, the failure rate was 4% at the VA. Why is that? And people wrote it off as, well, they don't keep as good a records or something at the VA. And I don't think that's the explanation. The explanation is what came out on this study, which is Moeller from Copenhagen. I call this the mother of all failure studies. These guys were trying to show whether pulse oximetry was effective or not in preventing perioperative complications. And by the way, they failed to show that. They failed to show that a pulse oximeter improves outcome in the operating room, which I use that as an argument for why outcome studies as a whole are very limited in their ability to tell you the truth. But the point is, they had 10,000 patients in each of two groups. One of the groups did not have pulse oximetry, the other group did. And in the group that did have pulse oximetry, this is a sidelight of the main goal of the study, they found, like Moeller did, or like Overand did, a 1% failure rate in most of the patients in the ASA1s. But the failure rate was twice that high for the ASA2s and so forth. And by the time you get up to the ASA4s, which are the sick people, the failure rate was 7%. It tends to fail more, not only in the sicker patients, but when those patients are doing poorly. That led, and notice the p-value here. I've never seen a p-value that low in a human study. That led my good friend Jeremy Swan, who I had the pleasure of becoming associated with for a little while, brilliant and really nice guy, of course the inventor of the Swan-Ganz catheter. That led him to coin this term of a fair weather friend. The pulse oximeter tends to work when everything is fine. It tends to bail out on you when you need it the most. Well, one of the common forms of failure is motion artifact. And I'll say a few words about that. Here is a bizarre ritual that we perform in Tucson, Arizona, among other places, that would certainly create motion artifact. When you have patients moving, and ask yourself, why do patients move? Why are they agitated in the recovery room? It might be because they're hypoxic. That's a very common reason. Notice that you have not only the arterial blood pulsating here, as in Aoyagi's assumption number 2, but you've also got venous blood sloshing around here. In other words, during motion, assumption number 2 is violated right there, and conventional pulse oximeters often display a saturation value that is lower than the actual. In other words, they'll give you false alarms, or they will just quit working entirely. And so we needed motion-resistant pulse oximetry, and here's where I come in, and Masimo came in. This is my laboratory at the University of Arizona. Does this very nice-looking young college student look worried at all? Not at all. She's connected to an anesthesia machine that I have specially modified, and this anesthesia machine can deliver an FiO2, an inspired oxygen fraction value of 0, because it blends nitrogen and oxygen in any mixture ratio that I select. I literally have this machine chained to the wall back here so that nobody comes in and borrows it, you know, to do a procedure in the cath lab or something on a patient, because it has been modified. Notice that her hand is on a machine here. This is a motion table. It can move up and down or even back and forth. Notice that she has 3 pulse oximeters, and notice also that they are optically shielded. Like I said, light interference, don't let the light hit the sensor. That's kind of common sense. So this hand is moving up and down with the motion table, and you can barely see the other hand over here has also got pulse oximeters on it. So those are the controls on the non-moving hand. We have tested over 21 instruments in this protocol, both during normoxic and hypoxic conditions. You can see, you know, part of our stack here, and you can see they're reading numbers in the 70s. This was probably at a time when the patient was actually hypoxic. And here's the kind of thing that we found right away. This is a healthy subject like the young lady you just saw. Breathing room air, and her real saturation is 100%. Heart rate is 72. Actual heart rate is 72. Those are the values from the control hand. Here are two pulse oximeters on the moving hand. You see what this one is. It's reading a heart rate of 180 and a saturation of 82%. In other words, it's giving us a false alarm of hypoxia and a severe tachycardia caused by the motion. Now this is worth a place in the Smithsonian. This is the old, I bet a lot of you haven't even seen this. I still have one in my lab. It was called the IV2000. It was an early prototype of a Masimo SET pulse oximeter. But you notice on the same hand it's reading 100% sat, 73 pulse rate. So one pulse oximeter was fooled by the motion, another was not. Two types of errors were uncovered in this protocol. One is the type that I just showed you, and that is patient breathing room air. In other words, they are normoxic. You start the motion, and the green line here is a control. In other words, the hand that's not moving. They're normoxic the whole time. The red line is the Masimo SET on the moving hand, and you see it's pretty much follows the same thing. It's not fooled. And then you have two other pulse oximeters here, the two different blues, on the moving hand, both of which register false desaturations. So I call this type of error false desats or false alarms. The other type of error you get is during actual hypoxemia, and you could say this is more dangerous. Here is an actual hypoxemic episode. Again, the green line is the control, down and up. And you notice we took this subject actually below 70%. Our target was between 70 and 75% saturation. We did these rapid down and up maneuvers simulating. We did it with FiO2. We were simulating obstruction. You see two different errors here. One with the light blue, you see there's a false desat being shown there. But when the real desat occurs, not much happens. There's not much change. And you wouldn't make a lot out of that tracing. The other type of error is what I call dropout. In other words, just as the hypoxemic episode was occurring, this pulse oximeter, which is this one shown here, 395, basically dropped out and ceased displaying any information at all. So you have false desats and you have dropouts. Now here is the tabulated data averaging several different pulse oximeters. We put this older N295 in here to show what a non-motion resistant pulse oximeter would do in this protocol. All of these other instruments named here were devices that claimed in about 2000 that claimed to be motion resistance. I defined this term called performance index in the following way. It's the percentage of time during which one, the pulse oximeter is working, it's displaying a number and it's not displaying an alarm. So it's giving you a number. And two, that number is within 7%, that's pretty forgiving, is within 7% of the control value on the other hand that's not moving, okay? And you can see the numbers for yourself. Masimo 93, the rest of these down to a low of 58% for a device that claimed to be motion resistant. Here are the corresponding sensitivities and specificities. Remember, specificity is going to be basically 1 minus the false alarm rate. So if you've got a low specificity, you're going to have a lot of false alarms. If you have a low sensitivity, it means you're going to miss a lot of true desats. Other limitations of pulse oximetry. Well, there's one that I alluded to before, but I'm going to now show you a clinical application of that where the rubber meets the road, and that is endobronchial intubation. I showed you the neurosurgery case at the beginning. Here is an experiment done in animals with 4 different oxygen sensors as a function of time. At time 0 here, the endotracheal tube was again moved from the trachea into the left main stem bronchus of the animal. So they were one lung ventilation. And you see 4 sensors. One is the Optode, which is the dashed line. The dotted line here is transcutaneous PO2, which we'll talk about very briefly. The solid line that says PaO2, that's sequential blood gases drawn from the artery, measured in the lab. You see all three of those, and they are all PO2 monitors, all three of those, quote, detected the endobronchial intubation. They saw that something had changed. But the pulse oximeter, nothing, fat, dumb, and happy. And of course it wouldn't show anything. The PO2 here never got below 100. So the saturation's not going to change. So this is a limitation. I know I'm repeating this limitation, but it's very important. This is a limitation of pulse oximetry. It does not give you early warning, especially when you're using elevated FiO2 values. And you can see this experiment was done at an FiO2 of 50%. Pulse oximeter does not provide early trend warning until the PaO2 is less than about 80. Second limitation is time response. This shows the difference between ear and finger sensors, and this is from Severinghouse's laboratory, where he took his volunteers and made them hypoxic, and he measured not only pulse oximeter tracings during these brief but profound hypoxemic episodes down to a saturation of 50%, but only for about a minute. He also measured the end expired oxygen concentration from the lung, labeled curve C here. So this curve C is the desat resat as measured in the lung, okay, as measured where the blood is meeting the oxygen. And you can see there's 3 earlobe sensors on this patient, and they show a variable delay of about 5 to 10 seconds. But what's really fascinating here, and I duplicated this result in my own lab, is look at the finger sensors. Oh my God, the delay is a full minute. Now that's bad enough, but when you're out on this end, the resaturation side, where you got the endotracheal tube back in, you rescued the airway, the patient was blue, you see the chest moving, and you know damn well you're ventilating, but that darn pulse oximeter still says 50%. When's it going to come up? That's the longest 1 minute in your life, and you get tachycardic, not the patient. So there's a reason, and I'm glad to see these new sensors today, there's a reason to think about sensors that are located on the head, face, earlobe because of this time response issue. The time response of earlobe sensors and anywhere on the face is definitely faster than finger sensors. I think Joe likes to tell this story that one of the companies I consulted for was called Sentinel, and they made a forehead reflectance sensor back in the 80s, and I consulted for them and essentially helped put them out of business because I showed that the device didn't work. It wasn't reliable. It had too high a failure rate. So Nellcor has come out with a new forehead sensor within the last less than 10 years called the MaxFast, and I was intrigued. I thought, well, hopefully they've solved the problems with signal strength and reliability, so let's get one, and we did, and try it on some patients. And this happened to be one of the first 3 patients. Here's the forehead reflectance sensor properly applied according to their directions. He's having an anterior neck dissection, so he's having surgery on his neck. And you can see this color is honest. He's kind of purple looking because he's got some venous obstruction. So is forehead reflectance a good idea or just an old idea recycled? Well, here is the device, what it was reading intraoperatively. Saturation, yes, you're reading that right. It says 63%. Pulse rate is reading correctly. In fact, if I look at the tracing versus time, here is the forehead reflectance sensor in the 60s during the whole case, and it comes back up to normal as we woke him up. Here is a simultaneous earlobe sensor, and this patient did have bad COPD, so his oxygenation is not great. Here's a blood gas. So his true sat is in the 90s, the earlobe is in the 90s, but the forehead is in the 60s. The pulse rate is correct. So it's reading the correct pulse rate, but it's not reading the correct saturation. Why? Venous pulsations, obviously. Now, not every patient has this problem. In fact, I'll say in most patients, I found the same thing with the Sentinel in the 80s. In most patients, it works okay. But most isn't good enough for us in this business. So I did 22 patients in this study comparing a Masimo earlobe sensor with the reflectance sensor on the forehead. And here's what I found. The gist of it is that the percentage of time during which the error of this pulse oximeter compared to blood gas values was greater than 7%. That was 2.5% of the time with the earlobe sensor and 28% of the time with the forehead sensor. That's not a tolerable, acceptable error. Nothing is idiot-proof. We're on the home stretch with pulse oximetry here. Nothing is idiot-proof. I keep telling myself that. I used to say, pulse oximeter, the good news is you can't harm a patient with it unless maybe you dropped it on their head. Well, somebody proved me wrong. This is a case report from 1990. What they did is they connected a physio-control sensor to an O.Hb 3700 pulse oximeter. The electrical connectors were the same. Must be okay, right? Well, it turned out the wiring diagrams were different, and the current that is normally fed to the LED was instead being fed to the photodiode, which was not designed to take that kind of current, and got very hot. And you can see this is a 3rd-degree burn. The sad thing, and look at that blister, sad thing about this case is the pulse ox obviously wasn't working. So what did they do? They took it off the finger and put it on the kid's earlobe. Honest to God. They didn't show a picture of the earlobe. Nothing is idiot-proof. Now I got to show this because I'm a pilot. Are you flying on thin air? This is from June 2001, Flying Magazine. It shows 3 things. One, as technology gets better and better, and as when capitalism really works, I have to say, with competition, prices go down, because look at this, $395. The original Nellcor N100 that I showed you marketed for between $4,000 and $5,000 when it first hit the operating room. $395 puts this in your cockpit. So, but the third thing is whoever marketed this, and this was Nonan, had obviously to me never flown an airplane, because the numbers are too small, and when you shine bright sunlight on these numbers, they become invisible. When you're in an airplane at 12,000 feet, you're usually in bright sun. You're not standing still. The cockpit is hardly ever sitting still, especially in my plane. So you're bouncing up and down, and most of us pilots have over 50 years old eyes, you know. There's no way you can see those numbers. Can you read this? But I was recently flying on American Airlines from Dallas, and I always go through the Sky Mall catalog, and I came across this. My God, look at this. Look at the price. $69.95 puts this one on your finger. It looks like it's a little more readable. They got away from the LED display. I don't know how accurate it is. It's interesting that these people who wrote the ad obviously don't have a clue in the world what a pulse oximeter is. Look at this. You will receive your pulse rate as well as a measurement of the arterial hemoglobin in your oxyhemoglobin. I was intrigued by that. I wanted to call them up and ask them, what the hell is that? Something new. Other new applications haven't fared so well. This is one, you know, way back. Fetal pulse oximetry seemed like a good idea, but it's never made it to the market. Partly because when does the fetus get hypoxic? During contractions, right? During the maternal contractions. What do you get during contractions? I mean, this thing's screwed into the baby's head, right? Venous congestion in the scalp. So that's venous pulsations played hell with this and never made the market. Last but not least, there are other little side benefits coming out of pulse oximetry. One of them is PVI, or pleth variability index, which of course you're very familiar with. This comes from the idea that if you look at an arterial pressure waveform and you measure the pulse variation by taking the difference between the maximum amplitude and the minimum amplitude, divide that by the mean, you get this pulse variation index. That is connected and predictive of hypovolemia. Well, it turns out, as Maxime Cannison and others have shown, that the same is true of the pulse oximeter pleth waveform, that this variation in the pulse oximeter pleth is also connected with and perhaps predictive of hypovolemia. Here is his, I think, landmark experiment showing a pleth waveform with obviously a lot of variability, and here's the PVI, in someone who responded to fluid administration. So in other words, people who respond to fluid administration, which means they were hypovolemic, tend to have a high PVI, a high pleth variability index, whereas down here is a non-responder, and you can see on the waveform there's a lot less variability with respiration. This is all respiratory variation, of course. And looking at the PVI, it's much lower and it doesn't change during the fluid infusion, and this patient did not respond. Looking at, I love ROC curves, receiver operating characteristic. This is sensitivity versus specificity, and I have to say I'm one of the people who told anesthesiologists this is a good way of measuring the value of a monitor. Remember, on a ROC curve, if you flip a coin to decide whether, in this case, whether the patient's hypovolemic or not, if you flip a coin, you get a straight line going between these two corners. Well, notice that pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, the green line, our old standard volume monitor, is right in there with the flip of a coin. And here's the pleth variability index along with the arterial pressure variability index up there in the upper left corner where you want it to be. I should say PVI is not specific for hypovolemia. It's sensitive, but it's not specific. Here are more than a dozen different causes of increased PVI. Prominent ones worth remembering are bronchospasm or asthma, anything that changes airway resistance, and cardiac tamponade. Let's move on. Let's finish pulse oximetry so we have a few minutes to talk about these other monitors. So SpO2 is continuous, it's real time. Never forget those two words. It is also non-invasive and relatively risk-free. It's certainly a standard of care. It has at least two physiologic limitations, which I have told you. One is it doesn't show early trends of falling oxygenation until the PaO2 gets below about 80. And two is the time response to rapid changes, especially if you're using finger sensors. We need to continue to look at earlobe and other sensors that might be closer to the heart. The accuracy of a pulse oximeter is compromised by anything that changes either the color or the amplitude of that pulsatile signal. Color meaning intravenous dyes, dishemoglobins, any kind of additional absorbances. Performance during motion and low perfusion has improved with new technology such as the Masimo SET. And multi-wavelength pulse oximetry is finally a reality, and it's quite exciting. Not only measuring quantitatively the dishemoglobins, but even being able to measure total hemoglobin non-invasively with a pulse oximeter. So now let's go on to the organs and tissues for maybe 5 minutes. These are my grandkids, gratuitous picture of my grandkids. Transcutaneous PO2, I love this. I've done quite a bit of work with it. It's a pain in the neck to use, and that's why it hasn't been more popular. But a couple of things about it. One, it's a PO2 monitor, like the Optode. It's measuring the partial pressure of oxygen. And two, you can get PCO2 at the same time, because you can combine a Clark and a Severinghaus electrode and get both. You heat the skin, you melt a diffusion barrier or a window through the stratum corneum, and you basically arterialize the dermis underneath so that you get a PO2 that tracks with the PaO2, but it's not the same as the PaO2. That's one of the problems with interpretation. The next slide may be offensive to PETA because I've done a number of animal experiments, and so I'm going to show you one of my animal preparations for transcutaneous oxygen. So there it is, a dog model. It measures oxygen delivery to skin, and so it is not a non-invasive PaO2. And that's one of the things that kind of led to its downfall in the operating room, people wanted to think of it as a non-invasive intra-arterial or substitute for an arterial PaO2. It's not. It measures oxygen delivery, which means it's a combination of PaO2 and blood flow. And if you reduce the blood flow, the transcutaneous goes down. I could tell you several stories about that, which I'll tell you later if you want to hear them. It measures tension, not saturation. You can define a thing called the transcutaneous index, which is the ratio of the transcutaneous to the arterial PO2, and that ratio reflects perfusion. It'll change with cardiac output. It'll change with regional blood flow. The index also changes with age. In neonates, it tends to be around 1, so the transcutaneous is equal to the arterial in neonates. It goes down to about 80% in adults and continues to go down. But it'll also go down way below that if you are in shock, for example, if you have inadequate perfusion. What about combinations of transcutaneous gas and pulse oximetry? Here's an interesting one called the Tosca, which is not an opera by Puccini in this case. It's a combination of a transcutaneous CO2 sensor with an earlobe pulse oximeter. Here is an invasive monitor that I worked with, and I'm going to test you on your, this is a generational test. I was working with a neurosurgeon. This is a transcutaneous PO2 electrode sitting on the patient's brain during neurosurgery. Somebody date yourself and tell me, what is this device that I use to hold it in place with a constant pressure? What did I take apart to get this device? Turntable. Yep, it's my old tone arm from my turntable. Worked great. We applied about 10 grams of pressure and we got interesting results. Non-invasively, you can look at brain oxygenation by NIROS, near-infrared spectroscopy. This is the one that's on the market today, the Somanetics, and in the interest of time, I will just say I think they've gone too far in simplifying this, and they've thrown out the baby with the bathwater a little bit, because it measures a cerebral hemoglobin saturation, but it doesn't tell you whether that hemoglobin is venous or arterial or capillary. It doesn't do pulse analysis like a pulse oximeter. It's just looking at whatever hemoglobin is under that sensor. Could be 75% of the hemoglobin in the brain is in fact, it says so right here, is in fact venous or capillary, but that 75-25 ratio between the venous and the arterial can change during surgery or other stresses, so you don't really know what it's measuring. Yes, it does go down, the RSHB02, the Somanetics reading, does go down if you cross-clamp the carotid, but I don't need an expensive monitor to tell me that a surgeon has cross-clamped the carotid. I can ask him or I can watch him. What does it tell me that I don't already know? I'm not totally poo-pooing it, but I would rather have a monitor that is more specific and is either measuring cerebral arterial hemoglobin or even cerebral venous. I'd love a monitor that tells me cerebral venous or even jugular venous hemoglobin. That would be very valuable. Let's think of a way to do that. Last but not least, let's finish up with the venous blood, about 2 minutes. This is Sabino Canyon. We do have water in Tucson. It all comes at once. You take Jeremy Swan's catheter, the Swan-Ganz pulmonary artery catheter, you put optical fibers in it so that it can shine light on the mixed venous blood in the pulmonary artery, and it's shining light of, if you've got the oximetrics, which was later taken by Abbott, three wavelengths, blue catheter rather than a yellow catheter. Edwards makes one too, but theirs was only 2 wavelengths. And here we are back to the Fick equation as I promised you. Same equation we derived at the beginning, but now we have solved it for SVO2. So notice that SVO2, mixed venous saturation, depends on 4 variables. It depends on the arterial saturation, no surprise. It depends on the oxygen consumption. If you increase your oxygen consumption and everything else stays the same, you're going to decrease SVO2. There's a minus sign there. It depends on your hemoglobin and it depends on your cardiac output. So if you see a change in SvO2, you got to be smart enough to decide which of these 4 variables is changing. Maybe it's more than one. Normal values, again, the usual, 98% arterial saturation, our resting O2 consumption, hemoglobin normal 15, cardiac output normal 5, and you get 74% venous saturation, which we all knew to be the truth. Now here is one of the things this is good for. Something is wrong here. This device tells you that something's about to go wrong. It doesn't tell you exactly what, but this is an ICU patient. He had a saturation of under 60% venous saturation, so he was already stressed. Normal is 75. He's already stressed, but it started going down. And it's saying, hey, something is wrong here, something is wrong. Wake up, you guys in the ICU. Nobody woke up, nobody paid any attention. Guess what this arrow right here signifies, and the sudden drop? Ventricular fibrillation. This was an early warning that something was about to go wrong. Predicting fluid responsiveness. Here's the SvO2. It's low. It's lower than it should be. It's around 50. Successive fluid boluses, bring it up. You're probably, undoubtedly, increasing the cardiac output. Here's one I really like because it shows effects on oxygen consumption. This guy comes off bypass. His cardiac output's low, but then it comes up and his SvO2 comes up to normal. He's doing great, right? Looking good. But then it goes back down. Why does it go back down? All the way to 50. So they do a profile, a hemodynamic profile. His cardiac output is 7. That's fine, but his VO2 is twice what it should be. He's resting. He shouldn't be consuming 600 cc's a minute. Why is he doing that? Because, oops, we're at the end, marked shivering. So they realize the shivering is what's doubling his oxygen consumption. They give my favorite, very old-fashioned drug, Pavulon, stop the shivering and everything comes back to normal. Cool, VO2 effect. So to summarize with SvO2, it's continuous in real time like the pulse oximeter, but it's not non-invasive yet. Maybe we should think about that. It indicates the overall health of the oxygen transport system. Its trends will predict good things if it's going in a good direction, bad things if it's going in a bad direction. It allows you to do a lot of fine-tuning, like optimizing PEEP on your ventilator, positive end expiratory pressure. It depends on 4 variables. Some people think this is a bad thing. I think it's good. It'll tell you when there are changes in hemoglobin, cardiac output, arterial saturation, or oxygen consumption. If we insist on placing these expensive and risky Swan-Ganz catheters in the internal jugular and into the heart, why not add SvO2 for about, actually it's about $70 more now. How can you tell, I asked doctors this question, how can you tell that this picture is more than 15 years old? And the answer is, we never do this anymore without gown, full surgical gown. I think it's a little bit of an overkill, but fact of life. To conclude, we're at the end. Monitoring oxygen in the respired gas in the arterial blood are standards of care. We've made a lot of advances recently, especially with pulse oximetry, especially with multi-wavelength, carboxyhemoglobin, methemoglobin, total hemoglobin, and other side benefits, things like PVI to help us with volume status and diagnosing tamponade and things like that. But remember, this is all in the arterial blood, which is only stage 2. It tells us nothing of the oxygen delivery to the tissues, to the vital organs where that oxygen has got to go, especially the brain, heart, and kidneys. Organ-specific oxygen monitors, very limited today. You saw my turntable arm on the brain. That obviously was not leading to a commercial product. Watch for new developments, though. I think this is one of the directions of the future that people like you need to think about. Venous, finally, venous oxygen monitoring is an overall how are you using your reserves assessment. It tracks the overall health of the oxygen transport process and basically tells you in a gross way how the patient is doing. I always like to conclude with a Far Side cartoon. Gary Larson is my favorite cartoonist, and you also already know that aviation is my favorite topic. So if I can combine both of those into one, it's like a total win-win. So I'll conclude with this slide. If you only watch your fancy monitors and bells and whistles and gauges, and you never look outside the cockpit, in other words, never look at the patient, touch the patient, smell the patient, you're going to end up like these pilots flying their sophisticated aircraft, IFR, in the clouds. One of them looks up and says, "Hey, what's a mountain goat doing way up here in the cloud bank?" Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you.